Welcome to the Radio Wigtown podcast with me, Anne Brown. Charlotte McDonald Gibson is a journalist based in Brussels. Her book, Cast Away, tells the story of the refugee crisis through the eyes of 5 individuals who fled their own countries and survived to arrive in Europe. She told me how the crisis is seen in Brussels.
It's seen as a political issue rather than a human issue there. And that's what I wanted to get away from in Cast Away. I wanted to give the humanity back to the people who are arriving here. And it's not just in Brussels, it's politicians all over Europe, and not only Europe, the United States as well. Everywhere where refugees are arriving, it seems to be that politicians want to rob them of their humanity. They use words like, there's swarms of people, marauding people. And we had this terrible instance in the US recently of Donald Trump's son referring to refugees as skittles, which is just absolutely appalling language to be using about human beings. So yes, that was my aim, was to show that they were people just like you and I, people with the same fundamental aims and goals, which is to find the best life possible for themselves, for their children, for their families. It's never clear cut, of course not, and again that's why we have to see the humans behind the statistics and the headlines, because there's a variety of choices which people are forced to make in situations which put them on these incredibly dangerous journeys. And if we look at the route, which is the most popular route this year to getting into Europe, and that's from Libya to Italy, more than 3,000 people have died so far on that route. That's 1,000 more than this time last year. And at some point during the height of the summer, the likelihood of dying was 1 in 32. Somebody wouldn't take that risk, or 1 in 32 risk of dying, unless they really didn't feel like they had any other choice. So no, it's not people just simply thinking, oh, I know, I'm going to get on a boat and get a nice job somewhere in Europe. That's just not why people are leaving. That's not why people are coming to Europe. And the numbers of children coming this year are even higher than the past, because the situations are becoming so awful. If we look at Syria, the images we've seen coming out of Aleppo in the past couple of weeks are just horrendous. Footage from children's hospitals of young people just suffering these awful injuries from these bombardments, and the situation is just going from bad to worse. Peace efforts are failing. It's heartbreaking what we see. But I think it's strange, because you do have a lot of sympathy in Europe when people watch these videos, these TV clips on the news about what's happening there. But that sympathy somehow seems to evaporate when these people have left Syria and have arrived in Europe. Somewhere along the line, they lose that sympathy, they lose that humanity. And I don't really understand why that is at the moment, and that's what I'm really hoping to counter.
Do you not think they actually lose that humanity from governments where populations are really eager to help?
I think there really is a gap between what government policy is and what they say, and what individual people feel. I've experienced that going around the UK talking about my book, and so many people I've met have just said, I really want to do something to help. I want to help these refugees. I want to welcome them here. I don't understand why we're seeing this sort of rhetoric from the government. And I do think they're out of step with public opinion a lot of times, and we've seen concrete examples of that. For example, when earlier this year, when the Dubs Amendment went through Parliament and Parliament rejected it, and there was an outcry. This was to accept thousands of child refugees, unaccompanied child refugees. And David Cameron, at the time, his government was forced to do a U-turn and accept them because they were out of step with public opinion. And I think that we have to keep that in mind, that people do want to help. I think most people do have that moral imperative to help out other people in distress. But somehow it gets mixed up in other politics about internal EU migration, politics about unemployment, and it really shouldn't. They're very separate issues.
And I think that was one of the things that didn't get across during the Brexit debate.
Yes, it's very strange, because a lot of the Brexit debate was about internal EU migration. So it's about people coming from Eastern Europe, Central Europe, people coming from Poland and working in the UK, and whether or not that's a threat to jobs. And that's a debate. But somehow the refugee issue became intermingled with it. And you had Nigel Farage with that awful poster of queues of desperate refugees trying to cross a border with the headline "Breaking Point." But the movement of refugees into Europe has got absolutely nothing to do with Britain's membership of the European Union. It's completely separate. I mean, the UK was able to opt out of any refugee sharing because of various historical agreements they had with the EU. So they didn't even have to take part in any of the refugee sharing that the European Union did agree on. So it had no impact whatsoever. And Britain leaving the EU is not going to stop refugees trying to reach Europe from Calais, for example, from the jungle. But I think we should also say as well that the UK has been affected so little by the refugee crisis. I mean, if we look at the figures, the British government has agreed to take 20,000 Syrian refugees in the space of 5 years. In Germany, 1.5 million people have arrived in a year and a half, and they're offering them sanctuary. So it really is a tiny, tiny amount of people that are trying to come to the UK when you look at those sort of numbers. And the problem for Angela Merkel is that the rest of Europe didn't follow her call, didn't follow her very moral call to come to the aid of people in need. So then you have that situation of huge numbers in Germany alone, and you have such a burden then on one country and the infrastructure, and that leads to the rise of the far right. Whereas if other countries, European Union, it's the richest region in the world, it's 28 nations. If they'd listened to that call and said, yes, we can do this, then they could have done it and this wouldn't have happened. But they didn't. And now we've got the situation where you've got far right rising and communities divided, and it's a very depressing and dangerous situation we're in right now, I think.
Can we come back to your personal story, Charlotte? How many of the refugee camps or situations have you witnessed firsthand?
I'd covered refugee issues for most of my career, so that started in about 2002 in Cambodia. And so I'd visited refugee camps on the Thai-Burmese border, internally displaced camps in Pakistan, refugee settlements in Afghanistan where returning refugees were trying to make a new life. So I've been covering this issue for a while. In terms of the European refugee crisis, I started looking into it in 2011 when the Arab Spring began and we first saw these movements of people. And then I moved to Brussels in 2013 and started travelling around Europe and visiting different places and seeing what was going on. So I went to Morocco where people were trying to cross the fence into a little Spanish enclave where they were being shot at with pellet guns by Spanish police. I went to Bulgaria where the conditions were just horrendous. And I travelled around a lot, although specifically in terms of the research for Cast Away, that research was really spending a lot of one-on-one time with the 5 individuals featured in the book. So that was travelling to where they have settled now in Malta, Italy, Germany, Austria, Sweden, and just spending time listening to them, listening to their stories, listening to their lives and learning not just about what happened from when they got on a boat and when they left home to when they arrived in Europe, but trying to understand where their parents came from, what their aims and goals had been. So you can build up a picture of them as a rounded human being, and then you can understand more about what they had to lose, really, what they were forced to give up when they were forced to make these terrible journeys.
How much difference do you hope your book will make to perception, if you like?
Well, the aim I had with it was to write a book that would be able to reach beyond the traditional spheres of EU policymakers or human rights and humanitarian circles, and that's why I wrote it the way I did. So it's narrative non-fiction, so everything that happens, everything in the book is true, it's non-fiction, but it's written with the sort of pace and the style of fiction, so it's like a story. And so I hope very much that people who wouldn't necessarily be interested in the refugee issue will pick it up and read it because it's gripping. It reads like a thriller in places. So I'm really hoping it will reach beyond a traditional audience, and that these messages in there of compassion, of also exposing the problems that the European Union has had in coping and its sort of moral failures in coping will be able to reach a broader audience. And, you know, if just a few people read it and think, well, actually, I see now they're human beings. And I have, it's astonishing. I mean, a couple of people who've read the book who, you know, are friends or relatives who are not necessarily interested in the issue, came up to me afterwards and said, I understand now, they're humans too. And I'm just like, really? That wasn't obvious? But it isn't sometimes, and it's not the individual's fault, it's the fault of the politicians and the media to a certain extent sometimes, that people just don't understand that they're exactly the same, you know, kind of people as you and I. So, you know, if I can get that across to a few people, then I'll, you know, feel like it was a success.
Charlotte McDonald Gibson's Stories of Refugees in Europe, told for the Radio Wigtown podcast.